Hello everyone, my name is Tabi Mkize and I'm a history teacher in Durban. Today we've been celebrating June 16, Youth Day, and I've always been very inspired by our country and our holidays and the things that we celebrate, obviously as a historian and as a black person and as an educator. And Youth Day is particularly important to me because I'm an educator and I'm a mom. And I just want to share what I feel is what we should be focusing on this day, because really it's about the children's lives that were lost. And it's important that that's how we remember it, before we remember it as anything else. And so I just want to spend a few minutes talking about June 16, and not to say that how we currently celebrate it is wrong or how we remember it is wrong, but to bring to remembrance those that I feel were most important on this day. So there's a song that my sisters and I have featured onto this video. It's a song that was sung by the learners as they were on the streets, and that's what actually triggered the police to shoot. This song was banned by the apartheid government, and the police shot at the kids when they started singing the song. I want to note a couple of things about it. Number one, it is our national anthem. It's incorporated at least in our national anthem, but it is our original African anthem. The second thing is that it's a prayer. And I find it so ironic that the apartheid government based their policies and their belief system on biblical tenets. And so they believed in God. And they actually used the Bible, erroneously, of course, to set up apartheid. And on June 16, 1976, they shot down the bodies of children. They shot down children because they sang this prayer. And so I hope that you enjoy it, and I hope that you sit through this little short lesson on June 16.
Ankosi sikelela, Nkosi sikelela, iAfrika. Awumaluphakanyiswe, luphakanyiswe, phondo lwayo, awizwa imithandazo, Sibe moya munye, sibe moya mu. Noma sekunzima, sekunzima emhlabeni, asihlukunyezwa, Nkosi sipha amandla we, Nkosi sipha amandla okunqoba, silwe noSathane, silwe noSatha,
Obviously, as a history educator, it's important to me to be factual. So I just wanted to take you guys through a brief synopsis, a brief timeline of how things happened. The first thing is that the Soweto uprising did not happen in just one day. It was a series of uprisings and demonstrations that actually happened over a period of about a year. June 16 happened to just be the first of many days of killings. And so, it's on record that it's over 170 children that died during these uprisings. It wasn't only in one day. And so it wasn't a haphazard or chaotic repression of children and their protesting, but it was actually systematic violence, planned and well thought out violence carried out on black bodies and children's bodies. So I think it's very important for us to remember that it didn't happen just on one day. It happened on more than that. So briefly, before 1976, we had the start of apartheid in 1948 and a period of resistance and repression in the 1950s, where people like Nelson Mandela and Walter Sisulu and Oliver Tambo and the rest became really prominently involved in the struggle against apartheid. And after that, in those efforts, you had the Defiance Campaign and the Writing of the Freedom Charter. All of those things happened in that period. In the 50s as well, you had the Women's March and sort of women's efforts as well. We'll talk another day about why women had to have a separate struggle. And so up until now, the youth hadn't really made their mark. So, it's very important for us to note that by the time it's 1976, I think they have a solid foundation of struggle, a solid foundation of fighting for your rights, because they have an example. So when we teach South African history, we teach on turning points. And a turning point is basically an occasion or event that happens that then changes the trajectory of history and what the future looks like forever. So the two distinct events that we define as turning points, one of the two distinctive events, are the Soweto uprising of 1976 as well as the Sharpeville massacre of 1960. Now, those two events are often confused, and when we celebrate them, which is Human Rights Day on the 21st of March, we tend to, just use the photos interchangeably. We know that Hector Peterson's photo is not used on Human Rights Day, but sometimes we do it anyway. But certainly we do tend to just tell that story interchangeably and dilute its power and dilute its impact on who we are today, on what our country is like today. So the 1976 Soweto uprising is definitely one such turning point where children protested against a government that hated them. And they lost their lives for doing so. On Human Rights Day, 69 people died and 180 people were injured. On June 16, 1976, from that day moving forward for about a year, over 175 children died, as well as adults in those protests, and about 4,000 were injured. And the release of the media on June 16 to the international community also added on to why this became a turning point. The world was aghast and appalled that any government would treat children like that. And it's interesting that as aghast and appalled the world was, apartheid still continued for about another 18 years from then. But that's where we're at. So there were a few causes of the Soweto uprising. The first I'll start with was the emergence of the Black consciousness movement. And that's basically my point, that the Black consciousness movement, promulgated by Steve Biko, was a powerful force that led children to, adults as well, that led Black people to start changing their minds about what it meant to be Black, and started changing their minds of what power meant. And Steve Biko basically said, you don't even bother trying to fight for your freedom before you fight for your freedom. And so the Black consciousness movements, like most movements we see, started in universities, university campuses, and then trickled into schools, and then into the greater community. And so, ironically, the apartheid government had encouraged the Black consciousness movement, because, it came with, adverts and stuff like, Black is beautiful and whatever. And they thought it was always just going to be a cosmetic kind of thing. But it's so important that the children of 1976 were so moved by this Black consciousness. And you can almost draw a parallel of the consciousness that children today are being impacted by, and that inspires them to to speak up for themselves in their own schools in this day. The two causes, I believe, are very important causes. There was the liberation of Mozambique and Angola, and whenever an oppressed group achieves liberation from the oppressor, and in these countries, Mozambique and Angola, it was colonizers, and that news travels. And the apartheid government had fought ferociously on the side of the Mozambican government and the Angolan, we'll call it government, that sought to suppress the liberation movement of indigenous African people, because they knew the effect that it would have in the country. And therefore, some historians do believe that the liberation of these neighboring countries of ours definitely influenced our scholars, influenced our students, influenced our African thinkers, that indeed it was possible. Remember, in Mozambique and Angola, organizations like the African National Congress had camps in those different countries. So the news definitely would have traveled, and the children definitely would have been inspired by something like that. The other one is an internal cause, which is Bantu education. That was an act of 1953, but the trigger was a directive that came in 1975. So just a few statistics of what Bantu education meant to a Black child. Nationally, the pupil-to-teacher ratios went from 46 children to one teacher in 1955 to 58 to one teacher in 1967. The fact that this continues in this day and age in this country is both logical and infuriating. Also, the government was spending far more on white education than Black education. So 644 Rand was spent on a white child annually, whereas only 42 Rand was spent on a Black child annually. So that's the education budget. And in 1976, there were 257,505 pupils, which had a capacity for only 38,000 students. So by 1976, we have a bunch of really frustrated kids and frustrated teachers, and a government that really did not care at all about these kids. Already, Bantu education, let's say, these stats didn't exist. The actual curriculum was a curriculum designed to keep Black people as subordinate to white people. It wasn't an education that was intended to upskill Black people in any way, nor to remove them from a place of poverty and disadvantage and being vulnerable to white domination. So with all that being said, then in 1975, there's a Transvaal directive that schools need to be taught in Afrikaans as the medium of teaching. That was the immediate cause. That is what made the protests and uprisings begin to rumble. Because as if education was not bad enough, now the kids had to be taught in Afrikaans, and you can imagine being taught maths in Afrikaans, being taught geography in Afrikaans, being taught all sorts of history in Afrikaans. There are some Afrikaans kids that wouldn't even cope with something like that. And those that do, that was a very systematic and deliberate thing, because, ultimately, it was Afrikaner nationalism. It was a sort of imperialism that they were trying out here in South Africa. And so, because of that, the Soweto uprising. Now, my reason for doing this video is to cast into a very bright light that June 16 is about children that were killed by a cruel and ruthless and brutal government that hated Black people so much that they felt nothing for the children. And as a Black person, I understand that racism is so traumatic that any kind of nuance or example of it just makes everything come back. But I just fear that we turn our attention away from the children, the learners. I mean, they're the most precious people in our households, the most precious people in our public spaces, and definitely the most precious people in our schools. And we not only need to be critical of a government that hates its own people. That's relative. But we need to be critical of a government that can act with such brutality onto children. So I hate apartheid, and I hate racism, and I hate everything that it represents. But I hate even more an institution, a system that would be that brutal to Black children's bodies. And so as African people, as Black people, I want us to remember the kids that lost their lives, and how we as adults are forever indebted to those learners that lost their lives on that day and during that time of about a year of uprisings. So that's us as Black people. And as white and all South African people, it is very, very important that we take Youth Day as a reminder of how things can go so wrong when we don't listen to our children, when we don't listen to our learners. I believe that everything that we are doing in the classroom, in our halls at assembly, in the corridors, how we interact with our kids, we're all trying to teach them and train them and prepare them for the real world. When those skills and that confidence and that talent and that education turns around and calls us to book, let us listen to the children. Let us listen to them. Let us engage. Let us engage in healthy conversation. Even in those engagements and that dialogue, let that be a teaching tool as well. Let's not corner them, because that's not a healthy or wholesome way of educating. Let's not invalidate their lived experiences, because that's not a wholesome way of educating. Let us not deny their right to speak up for themselves, because that is not wholesome education. And so, as parents and teachers, if June 16 stands for anything, I think it needs to stand for the voices of the youth. Let's listen to them, because they are our future. That was all.